Today's daf is daf Yud. That will start on daf Tes Hamid Beis with Itmar. So we're counting up 4 lines up from the bottom of Tes Hamid Beis. And the Gemara introduces now Machlokes Amoraim between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Shechata lishma lizrok dama shalo lishma. And we said that in 2 cases, that of a chatos and that of a carbon pesach, if you shechted it shalo lishma, it's possible. But here, the shechita was done lishma, but he had in mind to be zorik the dam shalo lishma, for the sake of another carbon. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psula, Reish Lakish Amar Kshera. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psula, mechashve mi avoda lavoda. In other words, a machshava that you have during one avoda for the sake of another avoda is meaningful. It registers. And here it registers in a way that it passes the carbon. And yalfinon b'machsheves pigul. The source for this halacha of Rabbi Yochanan v'chashem yavoda lavoda is pigul, because in the case of pigul, he had in mind when he shechted the animal that the zrikas hadam would be beyond the time limit, and that makes the carbon into pigul, which is completely possible. Reish Lakish Amar Kshera, ein mechashvim yavoda v'lodo, v'lo yalfinon mimachsheves pigul. So Reish Lakish says we cannot derive any conclusions from pigul, and the Gemara is going to explain that this is an old machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. V'yazdu l'tamayu, they are very consistent. The itmar, and here we start daf Yud. Hashoched es habehema al manas lizrok domel avodas kochavim. So at the time of the shechita, he had in mind that the zrika would be for the sake of idol worship, or lahaktir chelba lavodas kochavim. Right, there's something called haktaras hachalovim. And he had in mind that the Haktaras Achalovim would be for the sake of Avodah Zarah. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura, even though his shechita was a perfectly good shechita, but since at the time of the shechita he had in mind that the dam would be thrown on the mizbeach for the sake of idolatry, or that the fats will be burnt on the mizbeach for the sake of idolatry, then Machashvim Avodah Lavoda, and the animal becomes avodah zara, which means that's aser b'hana. B'alfinon chutz mipnim. Now, the word chutz here is a reference to any sort of avodah zara which is offered outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and we can derive that and compare it to avodas pnim. And just like in avodas pnim, machashem me'avodah lavoda, so too in avodas chutz, for the sake of idolatry, machashem me'avodah lavoda, that's Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish Omer muteres. Reish Lakish says that the machshava that he had at the time of the shechita for the zrika, that the zrika would be for avodah zarah, it does not register at all, and therefore it's not avodah zarah, and it's not asur. Ein machashem me'avodah lavoda v'lo yalfinon chutz mifnim. So chutz again means for the sake of idolatry, and we don't derive the laws of idolatry from the laws of pnim, of a real carbon. So in any event, we see clearly that opinion of Rabbi Yochanan and the opinion of Reish Lakish about whether machashvan avodah zarah is an old machlokas. And now the Gemara wants to explain, why do we need to be taught both cases? If we only had their machlokas with regard to avodah zarah baha, Amar Reish Lakish, here Reish Lakish says that we cannot derive any conclusions from pigul. Why? Because pigul is an avodas pnim, avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, and we can't derive anything from avodas pnim to avodas chutz. Aval pnim mi pnim. But if we want to compare the laws of an avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, for example, pigul, to the laws of shalol lishma, which is also pnim, then emo we might suggest that modu leil Rabbi Yochanan, he would accept from pigul the conclusion that machash mi avoda lavoda. So we need to know that the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish applies bifnim, and it's not enough to tell me that in the case of avodah zarah they argue, because we need to know that Reish Lakish, even in the case of pnim, will not derive any conclusions about shalol lishma from pigul. V'yashmin and ha, and if we only had the machlokas here in the case of shalol lishma, b'ha ka'am Rabbi Yochanan, I would have thought that since we're dealing with pnim and pnim, that's where Rabbi Yochanan would say, let's derive from pigul to shalol lishma. Aval bahi, in the case of avodah zarah, I might suggest that modi leil Reish Lakish tzrichi, therefore I need both machlokos. Ki asa Rav Dimi Omar. So Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and he said, Masiv Rav Yirmiyah l'siyud Rav Yochanan, Rav Ilo l'siyud Reish Lakish. Rav Yirmiyah brought in Eretz Yisrael a logical argument to support Rav Yochanan, and Rav Ilo brought a logical argument to support Reish Lakish. Let's go one by one. Rav Yirmiyah l'siyud Rav Yochanan, and this is going to be a kal v'chomer that would support Rabbi Yochanan's conclusion. Right, in the case of pigul, if he says that I'm shechting chutz lizmano, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because l'maisa b'fol, he's actually shechting bizmano in its proper time. But nevertheless, if at the time of the shechita he has in mind that the zrika should be chutz lizmano, possible, it becomes pigul. Is makom shim omar reini shochet shalol lishma possible? In the case of shalol lishma, where if at the time of the shechita he has a machsheva shalol lishma, it passes the korban. Again, we're talking about chatos or pesach. Is shchato how much more so almanas lizrok doma shalol lishma in udin shei possible? So that in pigul, the machshava of chutz lizmano at the time of shechita doesn't passel, because, as we said before, l'maisa he's shechting it bizmano, and yet the machshava of shechita for zrika chutz lizmano makes it into pigul. How much more so in the case of shalol lishma, where if he shechts it shalol lishma at the time of the shechita, forget about zrika right now, it would passel the korban. How much more so if he shechts it al manas that the zrika should be shalol lishma, it would passel the korban. And the Gemara rejects it. Maskif la Rava bar Ailoi malachutz lizmano shekain kores. Now, let's understand. There are two dinim that apply to pigul. One is that the korban is possible, because he had in mind at the time of the shechita that the zrika would be chutz lizmano. And the other halacha is that if he eats the meat of the pigul, he's chayiv kores. In the case of shalol lishma, on the other hand, although shalol lishma, for example, in the case of chatos, will passel the korban, but if he eats the basar, he's not chayiv kores. So maybe the Torah was more machmir in the case of pigul to establish that you could be you could passel it mimachshava lemachshava, because pigul is more chomer than shalol lishma, because pigul generates a chayiv kores, and therefore Rava is now going to come up with a different kal v'chomer to support Rabbi Yochanan. Ella Omar Rava bar Eloi Hachi Kamer. When Rabbi Yirmiyah wanted to bring a support kal v'chomer to Rabbi Yochanan, this is what he meant. Uma makom shim Omar hareini shochet chutz l'mkomo shehu kosher. But shchat al manas lizok damer chutzim koma apostle. Till now, we've been dealing with the archetype pigul of chutzlas mano. Now we're shifting, according to Rava, to chutzlim komo. Every korban has a specific makom where you can bring the korban, and if he shechted the korban with a machshav of chutzlim komo, but the shechita was done before, in reality, in its makom, so therefore that's ridiculous. So we don't have a possibility of a psul in the korban of a machshavas chutzlas mano, chutzlim komo, in the case of pigul. With regard to shechita. But yet, if he shechts the korban with a machshava that the zrika should be chutz lim komo, then it does passel the korban. Then makom shim omar any shochet shalol lishma shu passel. Once again, getting back to shalol lishma, where if at the time of the shechita he has in mind that this shechita should be shalol lishma, like for example chatas l'shem shlamim, then it passels the korban is eno din. How much more so? In a case of shchato al benas lizok domo shalol lishmo she'eno din she'e posel, isn't it therefore obvious that since in shalol lishmo there's a chumrah above and beyond chutzim komo and pigul, which is not really pigul, but that in the case of shalol lishmo, if the shchita itself is shalol lishmo, that passes the korban. How much more so if he has a machshava at the time of shchita for the sake of the zrika shalol lishma, it would passel the korban. That too is going to be rejected. Maskif law Rav Ashi malu chutzim komo shekei noig b'chol Zevachim toma shalol lishma sheinu noig el pesach v'chatos. We have a chumrah in chutzlim komo that the machshav of chutzlim komo, meaning at the time of the shchita, he had in mind that the zrika would be chutzlim komo. That passes all zvachim, all korbanos, without an exception. So the Torah is very machmir about a machshavas chutz limkomo. In the case of shalol lishma, that only passes two korbanos out of the entire matrix of korbanos, only chatos and pesach. Elam or Rav Ashi, and this is going to be the final formulation of Rabbi Yirmiyah's support, kal v'chomer, for Rabbi Yochanan. So now we're shifting from shinuyim, changes in the korban itself, meaning chutz l'zmano, chutz l'komo, over to chutz l'bailov, shalol l'shem bailov. And if a person says, I'm shechting this korban not for the sake of Ruvain the Bala korban, but for the purpose of Shimon, who's Ploni, the halacha is that it's kosher. The korban is kosher. It means that within the context of shchita, there is no psul of chutz lebailov, of shinu bailov. But lizrok damo l'shem Ploni. But if he has in mind at the time of the shchita that he'll be zorek the dam for Shimon instead of for Reuven, meaning that Shimon should achieve the kapar of the korban rather than Reuven its bailim, and that would passel the korban. Mokom Shem Omar Reini Shochet Shalol Lishma Shu Passel. How much more so we're more machmir in Shalol Lishma, because Shalol Lishma passels even the Shchita Shalol Lishma. Is therefore how much more so shchato al manas lizok doma shalol lishma and din shei posel, and that's the kal v'chomer that supports Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Ela, on the other hand, was siyur Reish Lakish. He comes along with some sort of a support argument for Reish Lakish of lo machashva me'avoda lavoda, lo te'omer bezrika. Now, the purpose of Rav Ela's support for Reish Lakish is to show you that there's an extra pasuk, and that extra pasuk is going to come to tell you lo machashvim me'avoda lavoda. Why? Because now that we've accepted Rav Ashi's kal v'chomer, that drew us to draw the conclusion that machashvim me'avoda lavoda, there would be no need for the Torah to tell me machashvin me'avoda lavoda, because we know it from the Kal V'chomer of Vashi. And therefore, lote omer bizrika, since we have Rav Ashi's Kal V'chomer, from which we derive that shalol lishma in a case of a machsheves shchita l'shem zrika shalol lishma, it's possible. We already have that from a Kal V'chomer. Teisim Kal V'chomer midbene mishchita v'kabol. Okay, now we have what's called a tzad hashove, where you combine A plus B, and we're going to combine now Kabbalah Saddam with Shechita. Oh, so what are we now deriving? We're deriving that if in Shechita Shalol Lishma passes the carbon, then how much more so in Zrika Shalol Lishma will passel the carbon? And if you'll say, well, Shechita has a chumrah in that it passes a carbon pesach if it was shechted shalolish, if it was shechted for a chole or a zaken who cannot eat the meat, that passes the carbon pesach. If the zrikas adam is done for a chole or a zaken who's not capable of eating the basar, it does not passel the carbon pesach, and that we know back on Daf Daled. The avod of Kabbalah is going to prove that we don't have that chumrah of shchita, so that if the Kabbalah of a carbon pesach was done for someone who is a chol or a zaken, it would not passel the carbon pesach, and yet Kabbalah has to be done lishma. So basically, from this Kal V'chomer, we're going to derive that Zrika has to be done lishma. And therefore, the question is, Rav Ilo's question, why did the Torah have to teach me that the Zrika Saddam has to be for the sake of this carbon and can't be Shalol Lishma? And the extra limud by Zrika is coming to tell me, Lomet the Ein Machashvim Avoda Lavoda. Just 1 second. Oh, yeah. We're in Reish Lakish now. Sorry. So therefore, why did the Torah have to go out of its way to tell me that Zrika Shalol Lishma is possible? And the answer is to tell me that only in the case where at the time of the Zrika he had a Machsheva Shalol Lishma is possible. But if he had a Machsheva Lishma at the time of the Shechita for the sake of the Zrika Shalol Lishma, it does not passel the carbon. Maskif Rav Papa doesn't like this. Vidilma, perhaps we could say that on the contrary. Why did the Torah go out of its way to teach me that the Zrika with a Machshava Shalol Lishma passes the carbon when I could have derived that from the Tzad HaShaveh between Shechita and Kabbalah? The answer is the Torah wanted to tell me that there's an extra Shalol Lishma in Zrika that passes the carbon, which means even if the Machshava Shalol Lishma was at the time of the Shechita. So the Gemara rejects Rav Papa. Im kain lishto kro minei v'teisim mikal v'chomer de Rav Ashi. Since we have the Kal V'chomer of Rav Ashi, and we derive from the Kal V'chomer of Rav Ashi that mechashve me'avoda lavoda, so why do I need an extra pasuk, as Rav Papa would have had it, to teach me the mechashve me'avoda lavoda in Zrika, when we already know that from the Kal V'chomer of Rav Ashi? And again, just to refresh our minds, Rav Ashi learned the Kal V'chomer from Shinui Bailan. So therefore, since I don't need this pasuk in Zrika, I'm going to tell us that Adarabah, the pasuk in Zrika is telling me that only during Zrika is a machsheve shalol lishma pasuk, but not during Shechita. Ve'idach, and what about Rabbi Yochanan? Parich hachi. He's going to reject the tzad hashava in the following way. Malahanoch, there's a chumrah that applies to both Shechita and Kabbalah that does not apply to Zrika. She came to Unos Safon, that in the case of a chatos, the avoda of both Shechita and Kabbalah Adam has to be implemented in the Safon, which is like the holiest part of the Azorah. The Yeshna Chatos Pnimios. And not only that, there's something called a Chatos Pnimis, where the Zrikas Hadam, where the Shechita and the Kabbalah Sadam has to be done in the Pnim. Pnim means inside the Heichal, and it can't be done outside the Heichal. Now, with regard to Zrikas Hadam, we don't have any of these chumras. The carbon does not require Zrika in the Tzafon, nor is there any case where you do the Zrika of the Chatos in the Pnim. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan would not have this combination, which we call a tzad hashava from Shechita and Kabbalah. And if that be the case, he doesn't have the extra superfluous derivation that Zrika has to be done lishma. Ve'idach, what's Reish Lakish going to do with this pircha on his tzad hashava? Because again, Reish Lakish's shita is now built on the tzad hashava, which makes the pasuk that taught me that Zrika has to be lishma as a superfluous pasuk. Hashtamias b'shlomim kaima. Let's take the case of shlomim. Shlomim does not require shchita in safon. Shlomim does not require any sort of zrikas adam bifnim. So all the chumras that you mentioned before, which would apply to a chatas, do not apply to a shlomim. And therefore, when the Torah tells us that the zrikas adam of carbon shlomim has to be done lishma and not shalol lishma, that becomes superfluous. And that's going to teach us that ein mechashvin me'avodah lavodah. Itmar. Shchata lishma lizrok dom shalol lishma. Rav Nachman Rav Psula. Rav Nachman accepts the shita of Rabbi Yochanan that mechashvin me'avodah lavodah. Rabba Omar Kshera, but Hadar Bei Rabba Lugabi Rav Nachman Mikal V'chomer Rav Ash. At the end of the day, Rabba rescinded his original view, and that would support Rabbi Reish Lakish that ein mechashvin avodah lavodah and it's kosher, and he accepted Rabbi Yochanan as Rav Nachman did that mechashvin avodah lavodah based on the Kal V'chomer of Rav Ashi. Okay, now at this point we go on to a different topic, and that's carbon osham. Rabbi Eliezer Omer ha'osham af es ha'osham, that the same way that a carbon that was done shalol lishma in chatos pasels of chatos, by equation, by analogy, Rabbi Eliezer holds, so too in the case of a carbon asham. If the carbon asham was shechted shalol lishma for the sake of another carbon, it's possible. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa on Rabbi Eliezer, chatos bal chet, asham bal chet, ma chatos shalol lishma psula, af asham shalol lishma psula. The reason for the equation of carbon asham to carbon chatas is because they both have a striking common feature, and that is the purpose of the carbon is to atone for a sin. Oh, now who's the bar plukta of Rabbi Eliezer? It's Rabbi Yeshua. Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua lo. There's a chumrah in chatas that doesn't apply to any other carbon. And that is the Mizbeach was split in half on the outer wall of the Mizbeach with the Chut HaSikra. And there was Lamala, where the Zrikas Adam has to be above the Chut HaSikra, which is called the red line. And all the other Karbonos, excepting Chatas, is the Zrika was done below the Chut HaSikra. So that's a Chumrah in chatas. Once the Torah was machmir in chatas with regard to zrika lamala, then we justify that the Torah was machmir in chatas that shalol lishma passes the korban. But in the case of Osham, which doesn't share that chumrah, and the zrikas adam of a korban Osham is lamata, and therefore it's lakula, it doesn't have the psul of shalol lishma. Omalo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer contends back to Rabbi Yoshua, Pesach Yochiach. I'm going to prove to you that the law of Shalol Lishma Pasels a Karban has nothing to do with where the Zrika is, whether it's Lamal Lamata, because in Pesach, nobody debates the fact that a Karban Pesach, Bismano, on the 14th of Nisan, that was Shechted Shalol Lishma, is possible, even though Domo Lamata and Shechato Shalol Lishma possible. So you see that this factor, this element that you're introducing into the equation, whether it was Lamala or Lamata, is irrelevant. I'll give you an example, a precedent of a korban where Shalol Lishma passes the korban, even though the dam is sprinkled on the lower part of the mizbeach, and that's going to be korban Pesach. Amalo Rabbi Yeshua Mala Pesach Shekein Zmano Kavua. I'm going to tell you that the reason why Shalol Lishma passes of Pesach obviously doesn't have the chumrah of Lamala above the Chut HaSikra, but it does have a chumrah, and that's Zman Kavur. The Torah tells you you can only bring the Korban Pesach on one day of the year, the 14th of Nisan. All the other Korbanos, let's say a Chatas, could be brought the whole year round. So it doesn't share that chumrah. So that Chatas has a chumrah of Zrika Lamala, Pesach has a chumrah of Zmano Kavua, and therefore they share that chumrah of Shalol Lishma passes the korban. Now, at this point, you could ask, why doesn't Rabbi Yoshua allow for a tzad hashava and combine forces between Chatas and Pesach, both of which are possible if Shalol Lishma? And the Gemara is going to pick that up later on, but let's keep it in mind. Omalo Rabbi Eliezer, Chatas Tochiach. I'm going to show you that this factor of Zmano Kavua is not a chumrah that generates the psul of the korban, because Chatas doesn't have a Zman Kavua can be brought the whole year round, and yet Shalol Lishma passes the korban. Now, of course, Rabbi Yeshua is going to say, well, wait a minute. Chatas has a chumrah that the Zrika is Lamala. Amalo Rabbi Yeshua, and here we turn to Daf Yudom at Beis.